5 bold predictions for week 2 of the NFL season. Number 1, I think we start maybe irrationally sounding the alarm bells on the Kansas City Chiefs. And in that same game, A.J. Brown bounces back in a big way, a monster fantasy week for him. So first off, I like the Eagles to walk into Arrowhead, take care of business, win that game by at least a full touchdown. I know it's a Super Bowl rematch. I know the Chiefs want to get their revenge. I just don't like what I saw from Kansas City in week 1. Defense was a mess. Guys are missing assignments all over the place. Players are arguing on the field. And worse yet, the offense looked exactly like it did last year. Now, that was enough for the Chiefs to obviously make it back to the Super Bowl, but that's not what you want to see. We were told this is the year that the Chiefs are going to air things back out. They're going to become the high-flying Kansas City Chiefs again. Look, all credit to Patrick Mahomes. He did what he could to keep them in that game in Sao Paulo against the Chargers. They just don't have the weaponry right now to match up with the elite teams across the NFL. No Rashee Rice until week 7. Xavier Worthy, he's going to avoid surgery for now. It sounds like he might try to play in week 2. We'll see. Didn't practice on Wednesday. Even if he is out there, you would think it's going to be in a limited capacity. So I think we really start to worry about this Kansas City offense. I think we get another letdown game this week against Philadelphia. We're sounding the alarm on Isaiah Pacheco. We're sounding the alarm on Travis Kelce. The rest of that Chiefs offense, I think the Chiefs start 0-2 for the first time since 2014. On the Philly side of things, got to be a bounce back spot for A.J. Brown. Did almost nothing in week 1. 1 catch, 8 yards on 1 target, was pretty much invisible throughout that entire game. But that was partially because they frankly didn't need him. It's hard to fault the Eagles for having too many weapons, for having too effective of a running game where you don't really need that high volume passing on a week-to-week basis. But I think the Chiefs have to sell out to stop the run first. And that's goal number 1 when you're playing the Philadelphia Eagles. The Eagles are going to have to move to at least a slightly higher volume passing game. The KC defense looked completely helpless against the Chargers passing game in Sao Paulo. Herbert threw for over 300 yards, 3 touchdowns. He turned Quentin Johnston into a top 5 wide receiver on the week, for crying out loud. This week, it's A.J. Brown's turn. Squeaky wheel gets the grease. He's going for over 100 yards. He finds the end zone in an Eagles win. Bold prediction number 2, Zach Charbonnet officially takes over as the RB1 in Seattle. So, look, maybe it's already happened because Charbonnet did outsnap. He did outcarry Kenneth Walker in week 1 against San Francisco. But I think by the end of week 2, we really start to view Charbonnet as the guy in Seattle. And if you're going to own one of those backs, he's the one that you want. We started to see Charbonnet's ADP creep up and up toward the end of draft season, and to me, for good reason. He's been the more effective back. He certainly looked better in week 1. Walker still saw the bulk of the early down work, but really not by much. It was Charbonnet who got all 3 goal line carries. He was in on the 2-minute drill. He drew 5 of 6 snaps in third down situations. Chances are this is still going to be somewhat of a frustrating split for fantasy purposes. I'm not saying Kenneth Walker is just out of the picture, but I think we come away from week 2 feeling even better about those Zach Charbonnet shares and really starting to panic a bit on Kenneth Walker. Steelers, by the way, who the Seattle Seahawks are matching up with this week, they just gave up over 130 yards to Jets running backs last week. We're not even counting Justin Fields in that. 5.6 yards per carry to Breece Hall. He had 4 runs of at least 10 yards. I think this is the week. It's all about Zach Charbonnet. Bold prediction number 3. This is Russell Wilson's final start of the season for the New York Giants. Look, I don't even know if this qualifies as bold at this point. We're 1 game into the season, and Brian Daboll already had to go to the podium on Monday morning and confirm that, yes, Russell Wilson will start in week 2. This is not ideal. This is not what you want. Sean McDermott doesn't have to go to the podium and confirm that Josh Allen is going to be his week 2 starter. John Harbaugh doesn't have to go confirm that Lamar is going to be out there in week 2, but this is life when you're the New York Giants. I think all along we always knew it would be only a matter of time before Jackson Dart was out there, especially by the time we got to the end of the preseason. But going back to early in training camp, the Giants said, we want Jackson Dart to sit. We like how that worked for Aaron Rodgers. It worked for Jordan Love. It worked for Patrick Mahomes. It almost never happens. It almost never works out that way. Teams feel the pressure. Front offices feel the pressure. We knew Jackson Dart was going to play at some point, but Russell Wilson was so bad in week 1. Only Bryce Young, Cam Ward, Tua graded out worse. He completed 45% of his passes, 13 percentage points below expected completion. He looked frantic. He missed guys in the red zone. He couldn't get Malik Neighbors going until it was way too late. Wilson was always going to be a stopgap. He was always going to be a temporary solution for the Giants. But I think the future arrives even sooner than the biggest Dart supporters would have expected. So this week, the Giants match up against the Dallas Cowboys in Dallas. Cowboys offense looked great last week against the Eagles, even without George Pickens doing a whole lot, even with CeeDee Lamb having some big drops. If the Giants roll over in week 2, if Russell Wilson looks anything like he did in week 1, I think Daboll pulls the trigger. I think Jackson Dart is your week 3 starter for the Giants at home against the Kansas City Chiefs, the 0-2 Kansas City Chiefs, remember, next Sunday night. Bold prediction number 4, Joe Burrow, T. Higgins, Jamar Chase all go off this week against the Jacksonville Jaguars. We are talking 25-plus fantasy points apiece for the receivers. I think we might see a 35-plus fantasy point day for Joe Burrow. Suffice it to say, it was a brutal fantasy week 1 for the entire Cincinnati offense, from Burrow on down, and really for all early wide receivers as a whole in week 1. Joe Burrow, 8.8 fantasy points. Jamar Chase, 2.6 fantasy points. T. Higgins, 3.3. Abject disaster. Now, Cincinnati absolutely should have lost that game. Cleveland had 11 more first downs. They went 9 of 16 on third down. They ran 22 more plays, 180 more yards of offense, 4.6 to 2.9 yards per play. Alas, it's the Cleveland Browns. The Bengals escaped disaster. They at least have a little bit of momentum rolling into week 2. The Bengals get a great matchup in the second week of the season. This time it's at home against the Jacksonville Jaguars. I think Jacksonville should be able to move the ball on the Bengals defense. I'm not sure it'll hold up quite as well as it did last week against Cleveland. So I see this as somewhat of a shootout scenario. But more than anything, I see this as a potential offensive explosion for Cincinnati. I think Jacksonville's a little overvalued right now. They were facing a brutal Panthers team, quarterbacked by Bryce Young a week ago. Not really convinced that the defense is significantly better than it was last week. They weren't really challenged by Bryce Young. I think Joe Burrow picks apart what is ultimately a very shaky secondary, tests that unit in ways that it was not tested at all in week 1. Burrow has a monster fantasy day. Both Chase and Higgins go for 25-plus fantasy points. They did that twice, by the way, in the same game last season. Bengals hang a big number on the Jags. They moved to 2-0 before entering a brutal stretch of opposing defenses over the next month. Our 5th and final bold prediction, Justin Fields, he does it again. 25-plus fantasy points this week for Justin Fields. Look, I'm in on Fields. As a real-life quarterback, we'll see. Maybe, maybe not. But in fantasy, absolutely. He is my most rostered quarterback this season for a reason. We saw why in week 1. I'm not just going to make this a victory lap. That was really the best case scenario in a game that closed with a total in the high 30s. I don't think anybody saw the Jets and the Steelers playing the biggest shootout of the week. But what we did see is what can happen when a team is willing to build an offense around a unique quarterback like Justin Fields. He ended up finishing week 1 as the QB2, thanks to Josh Allen's massive performance on Sunday night. But Fields' 29.5 fantasy points, to me, not a massive outlier. He had a couple big games early last season in Pittsburgh. He's proven he can be more than viable as a fantasy starter in the past. Fields completed 16 of 22 passes, 218 yards and a touchdown, ran in 2 scores, had 48 yards on 12 carries on the ground. You know, you look at those numbers and on the surface, nothing too crazy, right? It's not like he threw for 350 yards. It's not like he had 4 rushing touchdowns. You know, the touchdowns are going to vary week to week. You can't always count on getting 2 of those, but I think the workload in terms of the carries is going to be pretty sustainable. I think we see Justin Fields do it again this week. I'm not going to go as far as to say the Jets knock off the Buffalo Bills, but that's a Buffalo defense that mostly struggled last week against Baltimore. Gave up 70 yards to Lamar, 239 yards, 3 touchdowns to Lamar and Derrick Henry combined, and let Zay Flowers, by the way, get loose for the best fantasy game of his career. I'm not saying Justin Fields is Lamar Jackson. Let me be very clear. But I think Fields can again push for 30 fantasy points. I think he's a top 5 fantasy quarterback for the second week in a row to begin the season.